The rape of Nanjing, officially known as the Nanjing Massacre, occurred in December of 1937 when Japanese forces captured the city of Nanjing. Japanese forces were ruthless during the fighting and after, disarming and killing hundreds of thousands of Chinese, as well as raping thousands of women and girls. It is estimated that 300,000 Chinese people were killed after Japan took the city. Approximately 1,000 rapes were committed each night, with an estimated 20,000 women raped in all, and the Japanese were responsible for destroying much of Nanjing through arson, vandalism, and looting.
The Allied POWs had different experiences relative to the theater of war they were involved in. The European theater interned over 235,000 Allied soldiers. The Pacific theater interned over 350,000 British, Australian, US, Canadian, Netherlands, and New Zealand troops. Treatment of Allied POWs was brutal, regardless of front. However, the survival rates were vastly different. If detained in Europe, a POW's chances of death landed near 4%. If detained by Japan, however, the death rate expands nearly 7 times to 27%.
Japanese forces used chemical and bacteriological weapons against both combatants and civilians. Unit 731 of the Japanese Imperial Army, which was in charge of developing biological warfare methods, concocted a plan to utilize kamikaze pilots to infect San Diego with plague-infected fleas. This operation, known as Cherry Blossoms at Night, was never carried out. Typhoid and cholera were the major biological weapons used by the Japanese military. Pathogens were introduced to local water and food supplies, as well as released through bombs designed to disperse them from aircrafts. In June and July of 1942, in retaliation for U.S. air raids on mainland Japan, the Jinhua area was sprayed with pathogens. In 1944, during the battle in Saipan, Japanese forces planned to use biological weapons against U.S. forces. This plan, like many others, were never completed. The Comfort Women system was adopted in late 1937. Young women from Korea and Taiwan were exploited as comfort women and forced to perform sexual favors for the Japanese military. As the war waged on, comfort stations, or military brothels, were established throughout the Asia-Pacific region in places where Japanese troops were sent. Women were forcibly recruited from places such as the Philippines, Indonesia, and China, as Japanese forces occupied the areas. Many times, women were forced to choose between starvation and enforced prostitution. In areas where anti-Japanese movements were strong, Japanese troops recruited comfort women through abduction, rape, and continuous confinement for sexual exploitation. Estimates range between 80 to 100,000 women were forced into sexual servitude during the war. Japanese forces captured many prisoners, a lot of whom were forced to walk long distances in order to reach the prison camps. The Bataan Death March occurred in April of 1942 after Japan had taken the Philippines. About 16,000 Filipino and 2,000 American prisoners died after being forced to march 100 kilometers with little food and water. The Sandakan death marches occurred in 2 segments. The first began on January 29, 1945, where prisoners were forced to march through the jungle in heavy downpour with inadequate provisions for 260 kilometers. Those who could not complete the march because of starvation and disease were shot and killed along the way. By the end of the second march, which began in May of the same year, only 6 survivors had managed to escape.
Unit 731, commanded by Shiro Ishii, was a Japanese unit designated to create biological weapons during World War II. Many Japanese medical professionals turned their knowledge of disease prevention and water purification towards weaponizing diseases. To aid with this development, human experimentation was done on local civilians as well as POWs. Experiments included bacterial injections, frostbite tests, anthrax exposure, mustard gas, and diet experiments. If test subjects died from the experiment, they were often dissected so the specific effects of the test on their body tissue and organs could be studied.
The standard narrative promulgated about the Wehrmacht war crimes was they were committed by the SS. This notion was rooted in the idea that ordinary soldiers had no time for anything other than their focus on the battlefront. This proved not to be the case. Ordinary soldiers had experienced considerable war-induced hardship. Over time, these horrible experiences manifested into acts of barbarism. As the German army advanced toward Stalingrad in 1942, they committed heinous acts of rape, murder, and destruction with the intent of total annihilation, even gathering innocent civilians and performing retaliatory executions. With Germany's intent to commit a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, they enacted a directive consisting of barbaric orders of operation known as the Barbarossa Decree. This 1941 decree, issued by Wilhelm Keitel, established rules that essentially eliminated the limits of German soldiers' infliction of atrocities on the Eastern European front. The directive enabled German soldiers to commit war crimes of any severity with no punishment, especially against Russian soldiers and civilians. The primary goal of the Barbarossa Decree was to punish or exterminate anyone committing anti-German acts with no requirement to face war crime penalties.
The order known as the Kommissar Buffet was the green light from Nazi High Command to execute political officers of the Soviet Union on sight. This order was a brutal deviation from previous practices of taking prisoners of war, and these Soviet officers were easily identified by the badges on their uniforms. Most Wehrmacht officers followed this order without hesitation, but there were some that pushed these prisoners to the rear of their advancing forces to eventually be shot by others. Essentially, it did not matter how well German officers followed this order. There would be no consequences due to previous declarations from the Nazi government to ignore the rules of international law. Of the systemic extermination of racial enemies of the German state, like that of Jews, Romneys, and the disabled, it cannot be stressed enough that the average German soldier was not unaware of the outright murder of these groups, either on the Eastern Front or in death camps like Auschwitz. Whether informed through their own murderous actions, rumors, radio broadcasts from the BBC, or fellow soldiers, Wehrmacht troops were anything but ignorant about the slaughter. Those who worked for the SS in camps or in occupied territories all took part in this larger scheme to wipe out the inferior races from the Third Reich. Victims who lived continued to provide evidence of the systems of efficient killing and the all-encompassing complicity of everyone from neighbors to police to the specialized killing squads themselves.
In World War II, Germany anticipated capturing hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners and intentionally made no preparations to accommodate them. The plan was to allow these Russian prisoners of war to starve to death. POWs were crammed into undersized camps, which were frequently open fields surrounded by barbed wire. When buildings were present, they were insufficient to accommodate the number of prisoners held there. Prisoners were exposed to freezing cold temperatures during the harsh winters and often forced to live in their own filth, which caused problems with disease. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were used as forced slave labor as well. Overall, it is estimated that 3.3 million Russian POWs died at the hands of the Germans.
Sexual violence against women is all too commonplace in many, if not all, theaters of war. In reference to our material, however, this is especially true for the women in shared spaces as German soldiers. Laborers, prisoners of camp, Soviet civilians, and those captured and forced into brothels near the Eastern Front experience this horror frequently, if not daily in some cases. The woman during this time and in the areas under German control was without shame or prosecution by the law and grossly acceptable to fellow soldiers. Knowledge of this is documented via secret recordings from Allied wiretaps and some eyewitness testimony as well. The absolute violence in regards to women in this way cannot be dismissed or forgotten, for it was widespread.